Hello and welcome back to the Superintendent's Learning Session for Parents. My name is Annalie Nutter and I'm the Superintendent, and tonight I am going to give you a deeper dive into the budget and specifically into school budgets. I want to remind you before we start that at the bottom of the screen you will see two links. One is to ask questions and the second one is to engage in our thought exchange where you can have a discussion with others who also watch this series and talk about what you heard. This is for your information, and please pass along to others that this is available on our YouTube channel. All of the recordings that I've done are there. Thank you. So we will begin. So our agenda for today is to go over any questions that we had from last session. Then I'm going to do a quick review of where the funding comes from, followed by what the funding gets spent on in our centralized budget here at Division Office, and then dig into how it's allocated at the schools. To start, we didn't have any questions from last time. Just a comment to break it down further, which is our goal. So I just want to remind you that I am breaking down the budget topic into smaller digestible pieces. And so eventually you'll have all of the information the best way that I can present it. If I tried to give it to you all at once, it wouldn't be enjoyable, trust me. So I'm just going to quickly review what we learned last day so you know where the funding comes from. Essentially, the Treasury Board and Finance is where the money comes from, and it's given to the Ministry of Education. And then a mandate from the Premier to the Minister of Education comes through the Business Plan for Education, and that is passed along with the budget. And here on the chart, you can see from the February budget announcement that they have broken down the funding into different categories. On the left-hand side are the categories. And in the gray shaded area, you can see the amount in millions of dollars for each of those categories. So for example, when I look at instruction for early childhood service to grade 12, I can see that there are $6.5 billion that are assigned in the province for that category. When you cut the budget up and think of it more like a pie, it's easier maybe for you to see. This is what the funding to education looks like for the province. And as you can see, it's a big green area. That big green area is the instruction piece, which makes up about 78% of the entire budget. So it's a huge chunk. The ministry takes the funding given within each piece of that pie and decides how that they want us to split that up further. So in some instances, the subgrants are contained within those allocations, but they're all coming from those pieces of the pie that the government has shared, except for, if you see in the bottom right-hand corner, $317 million is now going to private schools, unfortunately. The Board of Trustees is responsible for making fiscal decisions of where the money goes. And if you look just at the purple, which is the part that Alberta Education gives us, all of the purple in this diagram is what I'm talking about right now. They give us about $45 million for schools, $10.4 million for student services, $20 million for pooled, $7.5 million for operations and maintenance, $1.6 million for transportation, $3.2 million for system administration, and amortization is there as well, but that's nothing from Alberta Education there. As you will notice, there's no purple. So essentially, the first three columns are all about the instructional piece of our budget. And by looking at our budget, I know this is really tiny to see, but if you just look at the areas that I've highlighted, the top area is our total revenues for each area. Across the top, you can see it says instruction. So the first two columns are for instruction, etc. It goes along. And then when you compare that with the second area that I've got a circle on there, that second fuchsia piece, total expenses, you can see that we always are overspending in a lot of the categories. There are a couple of exceptions, but overall, we're always operating in a deficit. So what does that funding that we get spent on? I'm going to start with our central budget at Division Office. All right, so $93 million comes to the division, and 45.2 of that goes to the school budgets directly. You can see on the right how the expenses are further broken down and that the largest part goes to salaries. That's all that pinky fuchsia color that you're seeing is all about salaries in each of those categories. So let's go to the next page, which tells us a little bit more about that. 45.2 million goes to schools, and about 40 million of that, actually 40.7 million of that dark purple area, is for teacher salaries and school-based EAs. And that was a priority area for parents. They wanted to make sure that we had enough teachers in the classrooms and class size was important and that they were supported. The remainder goes to those other areas. If we look now just at student services, this is the staffing and the resources that are paid for at the division level for special education and early learning. And that's about $11.9 million. So when it says student services, that mostly is about the inclusive education department. And what that means is there are a number of centralized services which this department is responsible for. So this department oversees the programming for special needs students as well as ECDP and K programming. So most of the educational assistants are paid for through this centralized budget. But it also includes contracted services like our speech language pathologists, our occupational therapists, any assessments that are needed and the people that do those assessments, consultants like doctors that work with us, behavior interventionalists, the mental health workers, therapists, deaf and hard of hearing consultants, the visually impaired consultants, the audiologists and the psychologists and physio. There's just a lot of contracted services. But it also covers office administration, which is our division director and supervisor and their admin assistant. It also covers programs such as Life Skills, VIP, Junior Skills, all of our PUF kids, and the III program. It covers professional development that are needed in this area. For example, this year, and probably every year, we have to train staff in nonviolent crisis intervention. It doesn't pay for transportation of students, but it does pay for supplies and materials. However, it's not your paper and pencil materials that the students are using. It's the things that last more than a year and move around the division. So things like iPads for the special needs or kindergarten and ECDP students, tablets, sit-fits, any specialized furniture like lifts or change tables, and then any software licenses that might be needed in this department for the schools. So who gets an educational assistant? This seems to be a hot topic, so I'm just going to explain the best that I can. Who gets an educational assistant? The government provides funding to inclusive education, and it's allocated to the division through a formula. And if you were here last day, you know about that formula. And it aims to ensure that the distribution is equitable for the funding. The funding is not determined through coding. So for example, one special ed student does not get funding from the government for a full-time educational assistant. There is no magic formula for each type of special need that a student might have. The government has no idea, or it would be very complex, even more complex than it already is, for them to divvy out according to the type of disability that the student has. So school authorities distribute the funding they receive based on the needs of the students that are in the schools. And school authorities know their students best, so the government trusts that they will use the dollars that are given to provide support for their students accordingly. At FMPSD, we have developed a process to determine the needs of each individual student, which is completed at the school level by the school team, and then they have a meeting with the Director of Inclusive Education. And the director meets with all of the schools and then begins the task of determining where the resources will go based on need. So she has a finite pot of resources. She can't just wave her magic wand and say, everybody gets what they need. We have to prioritize and look at the needs of the students. We do want to give everybody what they need. But if the magic pot runs out of money, she has to look for money elsewhere. So sometimes it takes till the middle of the year before we get the funding that we need. So when the staff are doing this needs assessment for the special needs students, what happens is they look at 8 domains, and they are on the screen in front of you. They are the ones that are the darker underlined category words. They look and determine at every level, in every domain, they look at whether the child is a level 1, 2, or 3. So 1 being mild priority and 3 being complex, and of course 2 would be in between. So they calculate a score, and that becomes the overall need score. And then in addition to this, they also assess the overall independence level of the students. And so they look at both of those things to determine what the needs are going to be for support. As I mentioned, this was an area that parents felt was a priority, to have that help in the classroom for students and have those supports for them. And so I just wanted to show you that last year we had 163 educational assistants, and this year we have 202. So we're up about 24%. However, we are up in enrollment of special needs students as well. We have increased by 27% this year of special needs students. So our enrollment was up about 8%, and a lot of those were special needs. So we also looked to see, okay, is there anywhere that we can move money around to help out the situation? And so a little bit of that was done. You can see that the average cost of an educational assistant is about $49,000 a year. And I want to just reiterate that just because a student is coded, it doesn't mean they get a one-on-one EA. It depends on their needs. Our goal is to help these students to become more and more independent as they move through the school, so that by the end of the time that they're graduated, we've weaned them off the supports and help them to become as independent as they can be, noting that every child is different and unique, and we know that there's some students that will never be independent. Sometimes if you're in a school, you'll see an educational assistant who might work with a cluster of 3 students, and that's because those students each have a higher level of independence and a lower level of need. A centralized cost is our FMPSD programs, and they are listed there on the screen in front of you. And this is a centralized cost because students from across the city move into these programs. So the cost of staffing, it's only fair that the cost of staffing is covered under the centralized budget. Our budget at the central level also covers supplies and materials, but like I said, it's not for the basics. It's for things that last more than a year and move around the division. So those tablets, iPads, sit-fits, the furniture, specialized furniture and such. Now, we are, like I mentioned before, we're never completely covered for all of the resources that we need in this specific area of the budget. I told you we only had $11.9 million for student services, which we received from Alberta Education. And so we have to find ways to meet our needs where we can. And what's not covered and is considered above and beyond, we get through special grants. And so far this year, we've gotten $1.8 million so far. So again, our needs outweigh our funding, and we try to get what we can. And sometimes the grants don't come until later in the year either. And we're trying to communicate that with the government and let them know that. It would be nicer if we didn't have to jump through all these hoops and apply for all of these grants. If you just gave us the money at the beginning of the year, it would be a lot better. So there are 2, on the far left column, you'll see 2 that say GOA grant. That's the government grant that we just received. And sometimes it's over 2 years. Actually, both of these are over 2 years, and often they're collaborated with another partner, as you can see. So these come later in the year right now. So we just have to sit tight and wait. We also go out and get our own funding, looking for grants to help us as well. And so you can see some of the other areas where we have received support to get some special funding for certain services for our students. So schools cover the basics, and student services provides anything related to special ed in their budget unless there are funds in the main school budget. Moving to the next section, pooled. For those of you who weren't here last time, pooled is exactly that. It's any kind of centralized instruction that we're going to share across the division, and that's why it's called pooled. Here are some examples of what that might be. So a lot of it is salaries. As you saw, it was a lot of purple. So for the safety coordinator, for our information systems and the technology department, for the First Nations Métis Inuit team, for the coordinators for literacy, numeracy, and ed tech, for directors of education and inclusive education, for human resources, for Apple Schools, for COLA, for all of those benefits and short-term and short and long-term leaves. It also includes things like services that we receive for our information system, Power School people for any licensing that technology needs, for the internet connections that we have, for software that schools use, and sometimes we use it for professionals that are doing audits to our system. It also includes supplies, material, and equipment, and recruitment expenses that we have, and anything to do with the learning disruption grant that we received, as well as our Leader and Me work. So it's a lot, but those are all the things that we share across all schools in the division. These pooled things are things that we must do to help support our students. So like I mentioned, the learning disruption grants are part of this, our FNMI supports. All of these help us to continue to improve and help our students achieve higher levels of success. The next major expense is in operations and maintenance, and you can see not as much of that is salaries and benefits, but it still covers a lot. Custodial staff is one of the biggest expenses in that budget. This also includes major maintenance items like ventilation systems that need updating, painting lines in parking lots, the ice and salt we use in winter, snow removal services, replacement of filters in our ventilation systems, repairing and checking the basketball nets in the gyms, installing floors in our gyms, and repairing roofs. It also includes utilities, so all of our gas, water, sewer, power, garbage recycling. Some of the admin would be our director of O&M and his assistant. IMR would be things like replacing boilers and windows and such. And then amortization, that is about $10.4 million, which is half of the budget. And that happens because when you buy an asset that lasts for more than a year, you expense it over a certain number of years. So for buildings, it's over 40 years, for example. Expenses by major type for transportation. You can see transportation is the lowest funded portion of the budget. It's only $2.2 million. It's always underfunded. We don't charge enough to cover the costs, actually. So urban funding with distance for each eligible student is about $510 per student. But the actual cost to contract a bus is $71,000. And even if we double loaded a bus with an average of 80 students, the cost would be $875. Not all buses have time to double shift. Like we have some buses for French immersion, and they come from across the river and even out to Sapray Creek. And so there's no way we can use those buses to double shift. So we do the best we can with what we have. Again, special ed, they don't get funding to cover the buses of that. And those buses are actually a lot more expensive because less students are riding on those buses. Anyway, the transportation budget, as you can see, the total revenue when we charge fees, which is $41 a month per student, our total revenue is 1.6. That includes the grant we get from Alberta Ed, which is $1 million. But our salary benefits and our contracted services are over that amount of revenue. So we're always in a deficit. We're over by about $400,000. And this just summarizes what I said. One bus is $71,000. We only collect $41 per student per month. So that's a total of $410,000. we have 30 buses, and in actuality, the cost is $1,750 per student to pay for this service for the whole school year, provided the bus is full, which ours are not all full, so it's actually a little bit higher on those buses than $1,750 per student. And we don't want to charge you $1,750 a year. So we're trying to do the best that we can and find ways to make changes where we can. However, this is the smallest part of the budget. And so even if we eliminated some buses, it's only going to take out a small piece of the pie. One bus is $71,000. Remember, an EA is $49,000. So if we got rid of one bus, it would only cover about 1.4 of an EA. So really, is it worth it in the end? The last expense is system administration, which is $3 million. As you can see, mostly staff salaries here. This includes the board, the human resources, the finance department, superintendent's office, all the employees there. It pays for professional development for any of these people and travel to meetings. And there is a cap on this amount. So there's only so much that we get for this, and we can't take money from other areas to cover any of the system administration costs. And we've actually been doing very well at keeping these costs under budget. And now to the part I'm sure you're all waiting for. How is it allocated to schools? So while the central budget, which is what I've just mentioned, helps with some school budget items, the remainder are handled at the school level. And the enrollment data will generate the staffing of the admin team, the school-based staff, that's the teachers, QP people such as the admin assistant and the librarians, and it also determines the remainder of the budget, so things for supplies and all of that. So the finance department looks at all the numbers through enrollment in the information system, and they allocate funds to the schools according to enrollment. And then those 15 grants that we spoke about at the beginning is what directs where the spending will happen. Each school's budget is based on their projected student enrollment and demographic data like the special needs students or the FNMI students. And in March and April, the school meets with the Associate Superintendent of Business and Finance. And then it's confirmed later, of course, in September, once all the students are in class and we can see and know that the bodies are there in the school, they actually showed up. And it's then confirmed with Alberta Education. So that's why when September happens, sometimes we're short-staffed because we have to confirm the enrollment numbers in September before we hire staff. Can you imagine if we didn't and we just said, oh yeah, we're going to have the same number of students, or maybe we're going to get more, so I'm going to need more teachers, and you're telling us this in May or June, and then something happens and the numbers drop drastically. Now you have to get rid of teachers. You have to give them back to the HR department, and then they have to find a job for them somewhere else. So this projecting is very important when it comes to the budget. You can see that this school has projected and confirmed 273 funded students. And that's about halfway down that table. It says total base funding, and then there are all those columns labeled at the top under green by grade level. And then at the far right, it says 273. That means this school will get funding for 273 students. If you go down to the bottom, it says total enrollments 299. That means there are some unfunded students here. And yes, if you look in the first column under ECDP, there are 26 students that are not funded. That means this school is running classes with 26 unfunded students. And so that's taken into consideration when we're figuring out our staffing. It's part of the equation. Based on the actual number of students and the average class size, we then generate the teaching assigned to each class. So it might look like a complicated chart. Let me try and talk you through it. You see where the red arrow is? That is we're pretending that is our current year. So in my current year as a principal, under the 2021-22 school year, it says bodies, and then it shows you in each grade level how many bodies are in each class. So ECDP has 19, kindergarten has 30, grade 1 has 27, and so on and so on. This year, I have 164 students. I then take those numbers and move them forward, basically. So the 19 changes to 29 in kindergarten the next year. So under the projected column for kindergarten, you see 29. That is because I had some unfunded students and now they are funded. You'll see kindergarten stayed the same. So when I moved from kindergarten into grade 1 the next year, the number's 30. There's just a little change in some places. That's because I know there's a new student coming in each of those for sure. So that's our projection. So when I meet as a principal with the business and finance superintendent, he says, okay, it looks like you're projecting 178 students. And based on that and the average class size, which I've listed on the far left, here is what you get for teachers. And where it says FTE generated, that is what I get for teachers for each of those classes next year. So I have a 0.4 ECDP teacher, a 0.K kindergarten, and so on and so on and so on. At the bottom, that adds up to about 6.2 teachers. So I know when I'm creating my classrooms for next year and my class assignments that I am going to be able to have 6.2 teachers. So then I can figure out what my class configuration is going to look like. So this principal has assigned 6.18 teachers approximately. And he or she has decided to create some combined classes and keep kindergarten smaller. They could have done something different. They might have had a big kindergarten, had everybody come in the morning, and then they could have had a straight class of maybe grade 3 and made a 4 or 5 instead. But still, those numbers are pretty low, so I don't know if I would do that. But they work through this and tweak it and find all different ways to do this to manage what they have for a full-time teacher number. So the principal makes a choice based on multiple variables. Sometimes an experienced teacher can manage larger numbers in a classroom and in the same grade. So then the teacher is okay and the principal's okay with having a classroom of 30 kids. Sometimes larger classes in older grades works better, depending on the needs. So maybe you have a large class and there's a lot of needs in there. You want to break that out. Sometimes they want younger classes to be straight grades. It just depends on the makeup of the class. There are a number of variables that go into the decision. So I need you to keep that in mind. And combined classes aren't a bad thing. The research shows that, there's some benefits to it. And if you have the right teacher in there and they are an experienced teacher with combined classes, they can manage it and still get through the learning. So we as a division review our class sizes, and we just did this actually. Mr. Kalal did that over the break, and he checked to see how many of our classes were under, within, slightly over, and then way over. And as a division, we can say that 88% of the classes are within or under the class size average. Those that are over, and that's a very small slice of the cake there, the very thin piece at the top next to the 11.1 is actually 0.8% of the classes that are over, well over the class size average. But when we dug deeper into it, these are high school classes like phys ed and learning strategies, which learning strategies is a module based. So it's not like they're teaching a whole classroom of kids. They're actually working independently. So they're larger, and that's doable. What's not doable is large classes of CTS courses like welding, where safety is a factor. And so we have to take those things into consideration at the high school level for sure. But just know that, the bulk of our classes are under or within the required class size. The other funding which the school gets is in regards to English second language learning, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and special needs students. And so I would have talked about this and all the formulas that they use to calculate the funds for this in my last session. So if you didn't get to hear it, please go back and listen to that, because you'll see how complex it is to calculate the amounts that you get for each of these. This school has, for example, funding in the following categories. You can see it's got some ECS mild moderate kids in kindergarten. It's got some Canadian born and some foreign born in other grade levels. It's got FNMI students in almost every class, and a few severe students. So the total other funding is 55.5 students, but the amounts for each of those different types of students is calculated differently. So please go back if you want to find out how that works. So these funds are used to support these students and get them whatever needs they are required. So for example, maybe I'm a First Nations Métis Inuit student and I am needing extra support in numeracy. There would be someone assigned at the school to provide that support to me, and the funding for that would come from this table and the formula that they get, the formula that's used to calculate the dollars for that. We also have to calculate in to our school budgets how much they get for that English language learner support, the learning assistance teacher, the counselor, and the First Nations Métis Inuit support. So Mr. Kalal will sit down with the principal when they're doing the budget, and he'll say, okay, you have enough funding to have 0.12 English language learner support in your school. And you have enough for a full-time learning assistance teacher and a full-time counselor, and you have enough for 2 First Nations Métis Inuit support workers. So that is also identified at the school level, and then the school assigns those to staff members within their building. And so those staff members take care of those supports. These are some of the other categories, and it's just a sample budget to show you. So there are other salaries that we have to think about, such as salaries and benefits for substitute teachers and temporary support staff. And it's not very much, but we do know that it's needed. For example, we build in days where we know that there's going to be support needed because the teacher's going to be out maybe to learn about the new curriculum and train on that, or other big picture stuff that's happening, the nonviolence crisis intervention training. There's a lot of days like that. So they get a built-in budget for that. And then you can see all of the salaries and supplies are budgeted for the school as well, based on the enrollment. And year to year, as a principal, you would look at that and say, okay, you know what? Last year, we cut down on our photocopying significantly. So for printing and binding, I don't need $2,000, I only need $1. So I'm going to move $1,000 somewhere else where it's needed. So it's not a lot to move around, but there's some dollars that you can move around. And this is just a sample budget based on a smaller school, obviously. But from year to year, we analyze the needs with regards to service and supplies. There are some things that we don't spend money on, and one of those is playgrounds and parks and the maintenance of both of those. So cutting the grass is not necessarily our responsibility, because we have a joint use agreement with the city, which has been in place for a number of years. And this joint use agreement allows us the benefits of playgrounds and parks without having to pay for the cost to maintain them. So as long as we allow the city to organize gym rentals for local city groups, which they do at a number of schools at varying degrees, we don't have to pay to purchase park equipment, playground equipment, or to maintain the fields. That is something that the city takes on, and that includes the lighting at ballparks and football fields. We don't pay for any of that. We're very lucky. But should this agreement not be in place, I'm not sure what would happen to the playgrounds. I know years ago that it was the parent councils that used to fundraise for that. And it wasn't so long ago. It was when I was at Greeley Road School, so that would have been 20 years ago. When I was at Greeley Road School, I know that the parent council there was purchasing playground equipment, and they were responsible for that. But since then, there's been some kind of change in this joint use agreement. So we are right now in a very favorable place, as I said. But should this agreement not continue, it could be an issue because we don't have money for playgrounds or to maintain them. That brings tonight's session to a close. If you have questions, please remember to go to that link. But also, additionally, you can ask your school principal questions about the budget. You can ask your school council to ask the principal to do a presentation at your school for your school council, and you can attend that. Anyone can attend those school council meetings. And if the principal knows in advance, then he can do a presentation for you. So, like I said, that brings tonight's session to a close. Next day, which is actually next week already, we have some more interesting topics for you. I'm going to talk about the school year calendar and how that is developed. I'm going to talk about staff salaries and recruitment and a few other things. If you have any topics that you'd like or you have questions, please email me or add it to the link. And we will do our best to get that to you. It is a bit of a rush for next week, but I want you to know that we're doing these sessions to help you better understand operations so that when we do have a survey in the future, you have a better understanding. So if you know people that have questions and maybe you feel these sessions would be helpful to them, please share that these videos are all on our YouTube channel. You just Google YouTube FMPSD and you'll get there. And like I said, send me any questions on the document, which is linked below this video. And please feel free to converse in the thought exchange, which is linked below as well. Thanks again for listening tonight, and I hope that what you heard will help you better understand our operating budget and how we are able to allocate funding to the schools. I look forward to seeing you again next week right away. I'm hoping next week that I can chat with you about the school calendar. So I will see you then. Thank you.